3 countries, cut off from their own regional bloc, one after another in the space of 3 short years. Borders sealed, bank accounts frozen, flights grounded, and every single one of them landlocked. Meaning every ounce of trade, every barrel of fuel, every sack of grain had to cross through a neighbor's territory first. On paper, this should have been over in months. It wasn't. Let's rewind and understand exactly how deep this pressure campaign went. Because the scale of what these 3 nations pushed back against is the only way to understand how extraordinary what came next actually is. It started in Mali. August 2020, a transition of power takes place, and within days the regional bloc ECOWAS, along with the African Union, suspends the country entirely. No vote, no seat at the table. Then in May 2021, a second transition and a second suspension layered right on top of the first. By early 2022, when Mali's transitional government pushed back its election, ECOWAS responded with the harshest sanctions package it had ever deployed against a member state. Land and air borders sealed shut, financial and commercial transactions suspended outright, assets frozen, military leaders barred from traveling. For a landlocked country already fighting an insurgency it could barely contain, this wasn't a diplomatic slap on the wrist. This was an attempt to strangle an economy from the outside in. Then Burkina Faso. January 2022, its own transition, its own suspension from both the AU and ECOWAS. The sanctions here were lighter, travel bans and asset freezes rather than full border closures, a reflection of just how badly the security crisis inside the country was already spiraling, but suspended all the same. Locked out of the room where decisions about the region's future were being made. Then, in July 2023, Niger, and this time ECOWAS didn't hold back at all. Full land and air border closures, a no-fly zone imposed on commercial aviation, the central bank's assets frozen outright, every financial transaction suspended, travel bans stacked on top of asset freezes for the country's leadership, and then something almost unthinkable, the open threat of military intervention. A regional bloc discussing the possibility of sending troops into one of its own member states, 3 countries, 3 suspensions, and a mounting wall of sanctions that most analysts watching from the outside assumed would break at least one of them within weeks. Because think about the geography for a second. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, none of them touch the ocean. Every port, every shipping lane, every fuel import has always run through a coastal neighbor first. Close those borders, freeze those accounts, and conventional wisdom said the math simply didn't work. Inflation would spike, shelves would empty, public patience would collapse, and with it, whatever these new governments were trying to build. That was the prediction. It did not happen. Instead, in September 2023, something happened that regional analysts had not fully priced in. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger didn't wait to be readmitted on someone else's terms. They formed something entirely their own, the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, and by January 2024, they went even further, announcing their collective withdrawal from ECOWAS altogether, not begging their way back into the room, building a new room, together on their own terms. The African Union responded with what it called deep regret, but added no further penalties beyond what was already in place. Here's where the story should have ended. According to almost every outside prediction at the time, landlocked, sanctioned, isolated from their own regional bloc, analysts gave the alliance weeks, maybe months, before the pressure forced a collapse or a climb down. Instead, something happened that very few people watching from outside the region expected. The 3 countries didn't just survive the isolation. They started building an entirely new map of how West Africa moves its goods, its fuel, and its future. And that map is where this story turns from a story of pressure into a story of resilience. Landlocked, sanctioned, cut off from the very ports that had always carried their trade to the sea. By every conventional forecast, this should have been the moment the Alliance of Sahel States buckled. Instead, they picked up a map and started redrawing it. Togo, Benin, Guinea, ports and corridors that had never been the primary route for these 3 nations suddenly became lifelines, and the alliance leaned into every one of them. Côte d'Ivoire. Despite the political tension hanging over the region, actually increased its trade with both Mali and Burkina Faso during this period. Niger secured entirely new channels for exporting its oil through fresh regional partnerships, built specifically to route around the blockade. Togo and Guinea, meanwhile, found themselves in an unexpectedly powerful position, their ports in Lomé and Conakry becoming central transit points for an entire alliance that had just been cut off from its traditional trade arteries. This wasn't luck. This was three governments moving with real urgency, understanding that survival meant refusing to be dependent on a single route, a single neighbor, a single point of failure ever again. And the results, by 2025 and into 2026, silenced almost every early prediction. Combined GDP growth across the AES bloc landed around 5%. Agriculture, mining and services all pulling their weight at once, defying the forecasts of economic strangulation that had dominated headlines just 2 years earlier. Break that number down country by country and the picture gets even sharper. Niger led the bloc with projected growth near 6.9%, powered by rising crude oil exports and a strong agricultural season. Burkina Faso posted growth around 5.0 to 5.3%, up from 4.8% the year before, driven by steady agricultural output, an expanding services sector, and a mining industry benefiting from higher global gold prices alongside the formalization of small-scale and semi-mechanized mining operations. A new mining code brought into force during this same window gave that growth even firmer legal footing. Even the services sector, the part of any economy most sensitive to instability, showed real resilience, buoyed by an improving security situation on the ground in parts of the country. Read all of that against the backdrop this bloc was operating under. No ECOWAS market access, no conventional banking channels through the regional bloc that once anchored their economies. Sanctions that on paper should have made growth like this close to impossible. And yet here it was, verified in the ECOWAS Bank for Investment and Development's own annual reporting. The very institution built around the bloc that imposed the sanctions was now documenting, in its own numbers, that the strategy had not worked the way anyone expected. By the time ECOWAS lifted most of its sanctions, the point had already been proven. The AES wasn't waiting on anyone's permission to survive. It had already found its own way through. But here's the detail that made this moment matter for the entire region, not just for these three countries. Even after sanctions were formally lifted, the new trade patterns didn't simply snap back to how things were before. Burkina Faso and Niger continued channeling much of their trade through Togo. Mali deepened its relationship with Guinea, while holding steady with Senegal after the brief disruption during the height of the standoff. In other words, the map had permanently changed. Coastal nations that had once assumed their landlocked neighbors had nowhere else to turn discovered, in real time, that dependency runs in both directions. Ports that leaned into the AES relationship gained new economic weight. Those that didn't watched trade routes shift elsewhere without them. This is the part of the story regional analysts still argue about today. Was this resilience simply a matter of favorable timing, higher gold prices, stronger harvests, oil exports finding new buyers at the right moment? Or did something more fundamental just get demonstrated here? A proof of concept that a mutual defense pact paired with deliberate trade diversification can carry landlocked nations through even the harshest sanctions regime a regional bloc has ever attempted. Whatever the full answer turns out to be, one fact was now undeniable. Sitting in black and white inside the reports of the very institutions that had tried to apply the pressure in the first place. The punishment hadn't produced collapse, it had produced independence. And once that reality set in across the region, the diplomatic posture toward the AES was about to change in a way almost nobody watching in 2023 would have believed possible. Picture the same institutions that once froze a nation's bank accounts, now boarding planes to visit that same nation's capital in person with full honors waiting on the tarmac. That is exactly what happened next. The turn began quietly in mid-2025, long before the headline visits that would follow. African Union President João Lourenço dispatched his foreign minister, Angola's State Antonio, as a special envoy across all three AES capitals. Not a formal summit, not a press conference full of demands. A listening mission. Antonio sat down directly with Mali's transitional leadership in June 2025, carrying a message from Lorenzo himself, describing the security crisis gripping the Sahel as nothing less than a continental emergency. His words carried real weight. Fighting terrorism, he said, requires the united effort of the entire continent, not the isolation of the very nations bearing the heaviest cost of that fight. Weeks later, he sat down with Ibrahim Traoré in Ouagadougou, delivering the same message, framing the mission around one simple question: what collective path can Africans take together to find real solutions? This was the African Union quietly admitting something enormous without ever saying it outright. Isolation hadn't worked. Dialogue was the only path left. But the visit that truly broke the pattern came in April 2026. African Union chairperson Évariste Ndayishimiye, president of Burundi, landed in Ouagadougou, not a special envoy, not a foreign minister carrying someone else's message. The sitting chair of the entire African Union, in person, the first sitting AU leader to set foot in an AES member state since the suspensions had first been imposed years earlier. He was received at the airport with full honors by the very men the African Union had spent years treating as an outsider to its own institutions, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. What followed wasn't a lecture about constitutional order, it was a tour. Ndayishimiye walked through citizen-led development projects on the ground, examined Burkina Faso's national development plan directly, and afterward made a statement that landed with real significance across the continent. He said he now understood the objective realities on the ground in the Sahel and called for what he described as a shared future between the African Union and the Alliance of Sahel States. Sit with the weight of that sentence for a moment. The chairperson of the very institution that had suspended Burkina Faso, standing in its capital, calling not for punishment, not for conditions, but for a shared future. And just months later, an even more symbolically loaded visit followed. In July 2026, Senegal's President Bassirou Diomaye Faye, newly installed as ECOWAS chair, boarded a plane just 9 days after receiving that role. Not to a fellow ECOWAS capital, to Bamako, the very heart of the alliance that had formally withdrawn from ECOWAS entirely. General Assimi Goïta received him personally at the airport with full honors for what was described as a 24-hour working and solidarity visit. The first time any ECOWAS leader had set foot in an AES capital since the bloc's departure. Discussions centered on restoring the vital Dakar to Bamako trade corridor, one that had been strangled by armed group attacks since the previous September, alongside broader security cooperation and a pragmatic form of re-engagement that never once required Mali to reverse its exit from the bloc. Faye offered what he called unwavering support to Mali in its fight against terrorism and regional insecurity. No demand for a return to ECOWAS membership. No conditions attached to the visit itself. Just two African leaders sitting across from each other, discussing how to move forward together. The two also spoke about deeper regional mechanisms, still very much alive despite Mali's ECOWAS exit, the West African Economic and Monetary Union, and the joint management of the Senegal River through the Organization for the Development of the Senegal River. Before departing, both leaders agreed to keep consulting with their regional counterparts, working toward a broader summit of heads of state focused on strengthening monetary cooperation and the shared management of water resources across the region. Read that list again. Trade corridors, currency cooperation, shared water management. These are not the conversations of institutions still locked in confrontation. These are the conversations of neighbors quietly finding their way back to the same table, on terms that no longer require anyone to pretend the last 3 years never happened. And this diplomatic tour wasn't confined to presidential visits alone. In September 2025, the African Union's Peace and Security Council held its own ministerial review of the entire Sahel situation, reaffirming its commitment to the sovereignty of every Sahelian state, calling for stronger intelligence sharing, coordinated border security, and accelerated support for socio-economic recovery in areas being reclaimed from insurgent control. The council went further still, endorsing the creation of a dedicated AU task force for the Sahel, and welcoming Angola's proposal to host a full Sahel summit alongside the upcoming Aswan Forum. Every one of these threads was pointing in the exact same direction. The era of isolation was ending, and what replaced it wasn't capitulation from either side, it was recognition. So here's the question worth sitting with, because every story like this deserves an honest answer, not just a triumphant one. Why did this reversal actually happen? Not because the African Union or ECOWAS suddenly changed their values overnight, because the strategy of isolation, tested against real evidence over real years, simply did not produce the outcome anyone had predicted. Sanctions were built on an assumption: cut off a landlocked nation's access to trade and finance, and the pressure will force a fast return to the old order. That assumption ran directly into three governments that refused to accept the terms of that pressure, and instead spent every one of those isolated months building alternatives, new trade corridors, new banking relationships, new security partnerships, a shared currency conversation that continues to gather momentum even now. By the time growth numbers came in around 5% across the bloc, with Niger posting nearly 7% on the back of oil and agriculture, and Burkina Faso's mining sector expanding under a newly modernized code, the evidence was no longer theoretical. It was published, verified, sitting inside the same regional financial institutions that had once been part of enforcing the sanctions in the first place. Security indicators told a similarly complicated but meaningful story. Parts of Burkina Faso reported real drops in the frequency of terrorist attacks, not because the crisis had vanished entirely. The fight across the wider Sahel remains far from over, but because coordinated regional effort was starting to show measurable results on the ground. Put those two forces together: economic resilience the sanctions were supposed to prevent, and security gains achieved largely without the frameworks that had excluded these nations for years, and continued confrontation stopped making strategic sense for anyone involved. Every additional month of isolation risked pushing the AES further from the continental institutions meant to represent all of Africa, while offering those institutions less and less actual influence over how the region's security and economic future would be shaped. Engagement, by comparison, offered something isolation never could: a seat at the table for conversations that were going to happen with or without an invitation. And that's exactly what's unfolding now, with both the sitting AU chair and the sitting ECOWAS chair having personally visited AES capitals within months of each other. The door toward renewed cooperation stands open in a way that seemed almost unimaginable back when those first sanctions were announced. Counter-terrorism coordination, trade corridor restoration, possibly, eventually, some framework for deeper reintegration, though notably on terms these three nations will help define this time, rather than terms handed down to them from outside. None of this erases the years that came before it: the suspensions, the frozen assets, the closed borders that tested just how far three landlocked nations could stretch before breaking. They did not break, and that fact alone has quietly reshaped how the rest of the continent and the institutions meant to represent it now approach the entire region. Because here is the deeper story sitting underneath every one of these diplomatic visits, every new trade corridor, every growth figure published by ECOWAS's own bank. For years, the assumption baked into regional politics was simple: step outside the established order, and isolation will bring you back in line. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger tested that assumption under some of the harshest conditions any African nations have faced in recent memory, and came out the other side with functioning economies, new alliances, and continental leaders now traveling to their capitals, asking not for surrender, but for partnership. That is not a small outcome. That is a fundamental shift in how sovereignty, pressure, and cooperation function across this entire region. The conversations happening now about currency cooperation, about shared water resources, about a possible summit of heads of state, are not the conversations of a bloc still trying to force three nations back into an old arrangement. They are the conversations of neighbors who watched those three nations build something real on their own terms, and decided the smarter path forward was to engage with what had actually been built, rather than continue pretending it might still collapse. The Alliance of Sahel States was born under some of the harshest pressure any regional coalition has faced in modern African history. It did not just survive that pressure. It forced the very institutions that applied it to come in person and ask how to move forward together. And that shift, quiet as it has been, may end up mattering just as much for the future of African sovereignty as anything happening on the battlefield itself.